A biker laughed as he mocked an old man at the gas pump, limping, silent, wearing a faded army cap. He had no idea the man was a war hero, or that someone was watching. Minutes later, a line of Marines in full dress pulled in, stood at attention, and what happened next silenced the entire parking lot. It wasn't just a moment of reckoning, it was a lesson in honor. If you believe respect should never be forgotten, type "respect" in the comments. The heat rippled off the pavement like a living thing, shimmering across the cracked concrete of the roadside gas station. It was the kind of summer afternoon that made the air feel thick, like walking through a memory. Engines rumbled at nearby pumps, cicadas droned in the cottonwoods along the edge of the lot, and the sky stretched overhead in a cloudless blue dome that offered no mercy. A battered Ford pickup, paint-chipped and dulled by time, pulled into the farthest pump. The engine sputtered once, then fell silent. The driver's side door creaked open, and a tall, thin man stepped out slowly, deliberately, like each motion had been bargained for. He wore a plain, tan shirt, tucked neatly into faded jeans, and on his head sat an old olive-drab cap. The edges were frayed. The embroidered patch on the front had once been vibrant, but now the words U.S. Army Veteran were worn into soft ghost letters, visible only when the sun hit it just right. Frank Delaney was 82 years old. His bones told him so every morning, louder than the mirror ever could. His back had a permanent stoop to it now, not from fear or age, but from years of marching with too much gear and too little rest. His right leg dragged slightly, a remnant of shrapnel that had never quite worked its way free. He moved without complaint. He always had. Frank reached into the truck bed and retrieved a walking stick that wasn't quite a cane but wasn't far from it either. He adjusted his grip and stepped carefully toward the pump, eyes narrowing at the blinking digital display. He didn't need much, just enough to get him home and back to the hardware store later in the week. The air smelled like hot rubber and gasoline. A bee buzzed past his ear, then vanished into the sun. Somewhere behind the station, a dog barked once, then stopped. Frank didn't rush. He never did. Life had taught him the value of steady hands and long pauses. As he pulled the gas nozzle from its cradle, his fingers hesitated for the briefest moment, aching from arthritis that no amount of ointment could soothe. The world moved fast around him, too fast. Kids grew up on screens, cars barely whispered when they passed, and no one looked up anymore. Not even at a man wearing a war on his head. But that was all right. Frank hadn't come for attention. Just gas, and maybe a moment of peace if the day would allow it. He didn't see the motorcycles yet. Not the smirking faces or the glint of polished chrome. That part of the day hadn't arrived. Not yet. Frank Delaney had the kind of silence about him that came from seeing too much. Not the nervous kind or the distant kind, but the sort that wrapped itself around a man like an old flannel shirt, worn soft by time and suffering. At 82, his body was a collection of healed fractures and unhealed memories. He didn't walk so much as endure each step. His knees creaked like floorboards. His right shoulder never quite sat right after the blast near Hugh City. But he never complained. The war had taken a lot from Frank. More than just his youth. More than just the buddies whose names he still spoke once a year on Veterans Day with a glass of bourbon and a folded flag on the table. It had taken his sleep. His ease with crowds. His first love for fireworks. But he had come home. His late wife, Marlene, used to joke that Frank didn't really leave Vietnam. He just brought the jungle back in his bones. She'd been gone 6 years now. Cancer, fast and cruel. He'd buried her on a windy April morning beside the church where they were married in '64. Since then, the days had grown longer, the house quieter, the silences deeper. Frank had no children, no close family left, just a few neighbors who waved from across the street and the local VFW post where the coffee was terrible and the conversation worse. But they understood each other there. The kind of understanding that didn't need many words. On the rearview mirror of his truck, his dog tags still hung, clinking softly whenever the road got rough. He hadn't worn them around his neck in years, but they were never far. They still smelled faintly of motor oil and sweat. One of them was bent from a grenade blast. He kept it that way. It reminded him that he'd lived when others didn't. He didn't tell war stories. Not because he couldn't, but because some things lose their weight when passed through too many mouths. What happened in that jungle belonged to the men who were there, and too many of them were dust now. Frank didn't need recognition. He didn't crave praise. What he wanted, more than anything, was to be treated like a man who had done his part and just wanted to buy gas without becoming a spectacle. But the world didn't always let men like Frank fade quietly. And today it was about to forget that silence often hides the strongest kind of courage. The stillness of the summer heat shattered beneath the roar of 3 motorcycles tearing into the gas station lot like thunder with handlebars. Chrome glinted beneath the harsh sunlight. Pipes snarled, and gravel kicked up behind black boots and louder egos. They pulled up in a staggered line, close enough to take up more space than needed. That was the point. Each man wore a leather vest heavy with patches. Skulls, flags, slogans stitched in thread that tried to look like honor, but came off more like theater. Loud voices echoed off the pumps, the kind of laughter meant for show, not joy. Cole was the first to kill his engine. Mid-30s, built like someone who'd spent more time lifting weights than wisdom. His biceps were tanned and veined, a full sleeve of ink wrapping his right arm. Dragons, dice, a faded eagle that looked like it was flying in the wrong direction. His beard was trimmed sharp, his sunglasses mirrored, and his voice carried like a cheap bullhorn. "Look at this," Cole said, nodding toward the Pump 9. His words weren't private, they weren't meant to be. Grandpa's holding up the whole station. The others followed his gaze. Frank stood at the pump, gripping the handle with stiff fingers. The line of his back bowed but not broken. He moved with care, because care was the only option when your joints no longer listened and your balance came at a cost. Cole chuckled. "Bet he's filling up that relic of a truck with Social Security checks." One of the others, heavier and older, snorted. "Probably got that army hat from Goodwill. Ain't no vet drives a beater like that." They weren't cruel in the way that stings quick and then fades. They were cruel the way rust eats metal, slow, dismissive, arrogant in its permanence. The way people can be when they think no one's watching but want everyone to hear. Cole lit a cigarette with a flick of his Zippo, a flag etched into the side. He took a drag and exhaled smoke towards the cloudless sky. "Should have put him in the history books, not on the highway," he said, loud enough for Frank to hear. Frank didn't turn, didn't flinch. Cole smirked wider. The game, for him, had just begun. Cole took a long drag from his cigarette, flicked the ash onto the pavement, and then strutted toward Pump 9 with the swagger of someone who mistook noise for power. His boots thudded with deliberate weight, not because he needed to walk that way, but because he wanted people to notice him. That was the kind of man he was, loud when silence would have said more. Frank didn't look up. The pump clicked as the gas flowed, slow and steady. His hand stayed firm on the nozzle, his body still angled toward the truck. But the lines of his jaw had tightened. Cole came to a stop a few feet away, right in Frank's line of sight. Then, with a sudden theatrical groan, he bent one knee and hunched over, dragging one foot behind the other in an exaggerated mockery of Frank's stiff gait. He made a show of it, grunting, stumbling, grabbing his back with one hand like a vaudeville act no one had asked for. "Hold up," he called, voice too big for the space. "Gotta practice my veteran walk. Don't want to miss out on that sweet discount coffee." The laughter from the other bikers rang out sharp and ugly. The sound twisted through the heavy air, drawing glances from nearby customers. No one stepped in. No one told them to stop. They just filled their tanks and looked away, like people do when decency starts to feel like a risk. Cole stood upright again, tossing his cigarette to the ground and grinding it out beneath his heel. "Hey, old man," he shouted. "This spot's for the living." His words hung in the air like smoke, thick, bitter, impossible to ignore. Frank didn't flinch. He didn't turn or respond. He kept his eyes on the pump, watching the numbers climb as if they mattered more than the noise behind him. Maybe they did. There was a silence to him. Not empty, but full. Full of years. Full of memory. Full of names carved into walls far from home. Silence that didn't need to be broken just because someone else was uncomfortable with it. The gas pump clicked again. Frank reached for the cap with deliberate hands. Cole laughed once more, loud and self-satisfied. Frank said nothing. Because sometimes saying nothing is the loudest thing a man can do. Frank tightened the gas cap with a quiet click, but his hand trembled as he did. Just for a second. Barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. He stared down at the metal, willing it to stop. Years ago, those hands had held an M16 steady in the rain while rounds snapped past his ears. Now, they struggled to turn a simple cap. Behind him, the laughter rolled on, snickers low and sharp, the kind that carried cruelty like a whisper through a crowded room. It was the laughter of men who thought age was weakness, that survival made you soft, that gray hair was the beginning of forgetting. It wasn't. Frank straightened up, slowly, methodically, the way a man does when he's spent decades training himself not to show pain. His cane tapped the concrete once as he found his balance. The world blurred for a moment in the heat haze, but the sound of the bikers stayed sharp. One of them mimicked a trumpet like a mock military fanfare. Another added a slow, sarcastic clap. Customers at nearby pumps turned their heads. A middle-aged couple near the air pump froze mid-conversation. A teenager in a hoodie glanced over, then quickly back down at his phone. An older man with a toddler rolled his window up and turned his gaze straight ahead. A few shook their heads, their faces wrinkled with mild disapproval. But no one spoke. No one stepped forward. Not even when Cole said, "Wonder what kind of war story he tells. Probably got that limp falling off a bar stool in '72. Frank's face didn't change. He'd heard worse. He'd been called worse. But inside, something shifted. A small, familiar weight pressing down just a little harder. Not anger, not fear, just that old, worn-out ache that came from being forgotten in plain sight. He moved toward the cab of his truck, each step measured. Slow. Yes. But not broken. Never broken. This wasn't the first time. Wouldn't be the last. People saw the age, not the years. The limp, not the cause. The silence, not the cost it carried. They didn't see the rice paddies or the red clay, or the faces of young men he couldn't save. They saw an old man with an old hat, and assumed everything else had faded too. He gripped the door handle tightly. For a moment, the reflection in the glass caught his eyes. Lined, weary, but still standing. Overlooked? Yes. Underestimated? Always. But forgotten? Not today. Cole swaggered forward, the heavy thud of his boots hitting the pavement like a challenge. His shadow stretched long across the gas station concrete, falling over Frank as he came to a stop just a foot too close. The air between them tightened, filled with something unsaid but unmistakably hostile. Frank didn't move. He stood beside his truck, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the open door, the other gripping the cane that helped him do what his bones no longer could. The heat beat down on both of them, merciless and unblinking. "Nice hat," Cole sneered, pulling his sunglasses down just enough to show the smirk in his eyes. "You buy that at a thrift store? Or did they throw it in with the senior discount?" Frank's faded army cap shaded his brow, the stitching worn, the fabric soft from years of wear. It didn't say much, just a simple declaration of service. No bragging, no explanation. It didn't need one. Cole wasn't done. His eyes dropped to Frank's chest, where a small rectangular patch was stitched onto the left pocket of his shirt. Olive drab background, gold embroidery around the edges, and 3 simple words: Vietnam Combat Veteran. The patch had been sewn on by Marlene, back when she insisted he wear it to the parade one year. That parade was long gone, but the patch had stayed. Cole stepped forward, too close now. He lifted a hand like he was reaching for the patch, like it was a joke on a shelf he could pluck and toss aside. "Let me get a closer look at that. Gotta make sure it's not from some Army-Navy surplus aisle." Frank's hand moved without thought. Not quick, not aggressive, but deliberate. He shifted his cane slightly, placing it between them. A subtle line drawn, a warning written in silence. Cole paused, the smirk faltering just slightly. Frank finally looked him in the eye. There was no anger there, no fear either. Just depth. The kind of depth that comes from nights under foreign stars, from carrying friends who would never see home, from waking up decades later with the weight still in your chest. "You reach for something you haven't earned," Frank said quietly. "You better be ready for what comes next." Cole laughed, but it sounded thinner now. Because suddenly, the patch didn't look like a novelty. It looked like something sacred. Frank didn't blink, didn't back away. His eyes, pale and unblinking under the brim of that faded army cap, met Cole's like stone meeting wind, unmoving, unimpressed. The younger man might have towered over him in years and bulk, but Frank had stood against worse, in worse places, and come out the other side with scars no loudmouth could match. He stood firm, one hand resting lightly on the cane, the other gripping the door of his truck. The tremble in his fingers had vanished. There was something about confrontation, real confrontation, that settled him, the kind that stripped away posturing and left only truth. "I earned that in '68, Frank said, voice low and rasped from age and cigarettes long since abandoned. "You were still a wish back then." The words weren't loud, but they landed like lead. The air shifted. The bravado in Cole's smirk cracked, just a little. A few people nearby, previously pretending not to watch, now turned fully, curiosity replacing discomfort. Cole laughed, short and forced. "Yeah, you want a medal for surviving, Pops?" Frank's expression didn't change. He tilted his head slightly, just enough to let the silence speak. Surviving. That was a word people liked to use when they didn't know what it meant. Surviving wasn't coming home in one piece. It was coming home and remembering the sound of your best friend's last breath for 50 years. It was watching families grow around you while you tried to sleep through the night without waking up in a cold sweat. Surviving was putting on clean clothes every morning, even when your heart still lived in a place where the air stank of gunpowder and rain. Frank didn't need to explain any of that. He'd long since stopped offering proof of pain. The truth lived in his silence, in the careful way he moved, in the weight of a patch sewn onto a shirt not for others, but for himself, a reminder, a tether to what he'd done and who he'd left behind. "You got a name?" he asked suddenly, still quiet. Cole blinked, What? I like to remember the names of boys who try to make men out of themselves by belittling someone else. He paused. Helps me pray for him later. There was no threat in the words, no anger, just steel. The kind of steel forged in foxholes and fire, tempered by decades of silence. Cole took a step back, and Frank turned slowly, deliberately, and climbed back into his truck. Because sometimes the sharpest blade in the world is the voice of a man who doesn't need to shout. Cole's laughter exploded across the parking lot, louder now, sharper, reaching for an audience that wasn't really there. It had that hollow ring to it, the kind of laugh that tries to bury discomfort under noise. But Frank hadn't flinched, and something about that unnerved him more than he'd admit. "Vietnam, huh?" Cole said, stepping back and throwing his arms wide, as if delivering a punchline. "Does that even count anymore? That was, what, before cable TV?" His two buddies roared. One slapped the side of his bike like it was part of the joke. The other, lean, with a scraggly goatee and mirrored sunglasses, pulled out his phone. "Let's post this dinosaur," he said, grinning as he angled the camera toward Frank's truck. "Stolen valor. Gonna get this relic trending." The screen's light glinted off his lenses as he recorded, sweeping over Frank's truck, the cane resting by the door, the veteran patch on the shirt. He zoomed in on the hat. "Look at this guy," he narrated, loud and smug, claiming to be some war hero, probably hasn't seen a battle tougher than rush hour traffic. Frank didn't react. He sat behind the wheel now, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other on the shifter. His face was turned away, watching the pump numbers blink to 0, but his jaw was set, the muscles in his cheek twitching. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned him. Age had made him invisible, and the wrong kind of people had always mistaken silence for weakness. But there was something especially bitter about watching his story, his scars, his dead friends, his years, turned into a joke for strangers on a screen. Cole leaned against the hood of his bike, arms crossed, still chuckling. "Man, these old guys think they get a lifetime of praise just for not dying overseas. What's next? Free groceries for being old and cranky?" More laughter. A couple nearby shoppers looked over, their expressions uneasy. A mother tugged her daughter's hand, walking faster toward the store. No one intervened. That was the way of things now. Everyone saw, no one acted. Cameras replaced courage. Frank exhaled slowly, steadying the rise in his chest. He'd seen men unravel in the jungle over far less than this. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Not today. He glanced once in the side mirror, not at the bikers, but at himself. He adjusted the cap just slightly, not to hide, but to anchor. Then he reached for the keys. Outside, the laughter continued. But Frank had survived things much louder than this. From the back seat of a silver SUV parked 2 pumps over, a boy sat perfectly still, his forehead pressed lightly against the glass. The world outside shimmered in the heat, but his gaze didn't waver. Caleb was 10, quiet by nature, the kind of kid who watched first and spoke second. Today, he watched everything. His mother, seated in the front, had noticed the commotion the moment the bikers started laughing. She'd glanced once, then again, her jaw tightening as she recognized the shape of cruelty masquerading as humor. Without turning around, she said quietly, "Stay inside, Caleb." Her hand reached back blindly, brushing his knee. "Don't get out, okay?" Caleb didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the old man in the army cap. The man hadn't yelled, hadn't shoved, hadn't even raised his voice, but something about the way he stood, calm, still, unmoved, held Caleb's attention like gravity. He could hear the laughter from where he sat. He didn't understand every word the bikers were saying, but he understood enough. He understood mockery. The old man didn't look mad. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that came from mowing lawns or staying up too late, but the kind that lived behind your eyes and in your bones. The kind Caleb had only seen once before, on his grandfather's face at the funeral, when the uniformed men folded the flag. Caleb had asked, back then, what service meant. His grandfather had said, "It means giving more than you ever get back." And now, watching the man in the weathered cap hold his ground while grown men with loud voices tried to chip away at him, Caleb understood something new. Service didn't end when the uniform came off. Sometimes it just got quieter. He leaned forward, resting his chin on the seat in front of him. His mother looked over her shoulder now, worry in her eyes. "Caleb," she said gently, "it's okay. Just ignore them." But he couldn't. He watched as one of the bikers filmed the old man's truck, watched as another mimicked a limp, watched as the old man said nothing. And somewhere deep inside Caleb, a place he wouldn't have been able to name, something stirred. Not just sadness, not just anger. Something older than both. Respect. He didn't know who the man was. Not yet. But he knew enough to know what mattered. Frank reached into the truck bed and retrieved his cane, fingers curling around the handle like it was an old friend. The rubber tip met the pavement with a soft tap as he steadied himself, the motion automatic now, worn into muscle memory. He took a breath, not deep, just enough, and began the slow walk back toward the driver's side door. He didn't speak, didn't throw a glance over his shoulder. The bikers were still laughing behind him, still playing to a crowd that wasn't really watching. But Frank had learned long ago that arguing with ignorance was like shouting into the wind. It wasted breath and never changed the weather. Some battles you fight, others you outlast. As he passed the rear of his truck, he paused for a heartbeat. The sun glared off the metal, and the old license plate with its faint bronze star designation caught the light. He raised a hand. Not high, not sharp, just enough. The edge of his knuckles brushed the brim of his cap, fingers bending slightly in what looked like a natural movement to anyone not paying attention. But Caleb saw it. From behind the window of the SUV, the boy's eyes followed every step, every movement. And when Frank's hand lifted, when that subtle, half-finished salute touched the space just above his brow, something clicked into place inside the boy's chest. It wasn't a salute meant for show, not for the men laughing behind him, not for an audience. It was smaller than that, older than that, a private gesture, a memory, a habit of honor formed when the stakes were life and death, not pride and reputation. A tribute to those who hadn't made it home, or maybe just a reminder to himself that he had. Frank lowered his hand and opened the driver's door. Slowly, he settled into the seat with the cautious grace of someone who understood how fragile the body could become, even as the will remained steel. The laughter hadn't stopped, but Frank had stopped hearing it, not because he was ignoring it, because it simply didn't matter anymore. Inside the SUV, Caleb pressed a hand against the window, not to wave, not to call out, but just to connect. As if that quiet gesture had been meant for him, too. And in a way it had. The sound of low tires on gravel whispered through the heat as a sleek black SUV rolled slowly into the gas station. The vehicle was out of place here. Too polished, too quiet, too precise. It glided into position at pump 6, engine barely audible, like it had something important to say but hadn't decided when to speak. The driver's door opened with a soft click, and a tall man stepped out, the kind of presence that turned heads without asking. He didn't slam the door. He didn't stride. He simply unfolded from the seat with deliberate calm, like a man who understood that speed was only useful when necessary. He wore the deep navy blue of a dress military uniform, the creases sharp enough to cut glass. Medals glinted faintly across his chest, ribbons in rows too neat to be decorative. On his shoulder, silver oak leaves gleamed, Lieutenant Colonel. His boots were polished to a mirror finish, even now, on blacktop that shimmered with heat. But it was his face that commanded silence, not for its expression, but for the lack of one. Behind dark sunglasses, his eyes remained unreadable, and his mouth held the stillness of someone who'd learned long ago not to react before understanding the battlefield. He didn't move toward the bikers. Not yet. He stood beside the pump, one hand resting on the top of the driver's door, the other by his side. The way he held himself, upright, unshaken, said he was no stranger to chaos, no stranger to men who raised their voices to feel taller. His gaze moved slowly across the scene. Frank, climbing into his truck, back stiff but unbowed. The bikers, still laughing, still filming, loud and loose with their mockery. And then the boy in the back seat of the SUV, forehead against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking. The officer's jaw tightened ever so slightly. He didn't speak, didn't announce his presence. Sometimes silence says more than sound. Sometimes a man in uniform doesn't need to explain who he is. His bearing tells the story for him. The bikers hadn't noticed him yet. They were still too busy performing. But he watched and waited. And in that pause, just a few breaths long, something began to shift in the heat-soaked air. The kind of shift that comes before a storm. The engine of Frank's old Ford rumbled to life with a tired, gravelly cough. He didn't rev it, didn't linger, just placed his hand on the wheel, eyes straight ahead, and pulled away from the pump with the kind of quiet dignity that didn't need attention to feel solid. The cane rested across the passenger seat, the tip worn smooth from years of faithful use. He eased into the parking lot's exit lane, tires crunching over scattered gravel, the truck's frame rattling faintly with every bump. Sunlight caught the tailgate as he turned slightly, revealing what most had ignored up to that point. The license plate, simple. White background. Black letters, nothing fancy. But to those who knew what to look for, it said everything. VET 1968 BSM. The numbers and letters hung in the air like a spoken truth. Vietnam, 1968. Bronze Star Medal. There was no mistaking it. No exaggeration, no theatrics. Just cold, hard recognition etched in steel. A hush settled over the gas station, thin but noticeable, like someone had turned down the volume on the world for just a second. The laughter stopped, not because it had run its course, but because it couldn't survive the weight of what had just been revealed. A woman near the windshield cleaner froze mid-motion, squeegee in hand, her eyes flicking from the plate to the rearview mirror. A man at Pump 3, previously chuckling along with the bikers, rubbed the back of his neck and looked down at his shoes. One of the bikers muttered something under his breath. The man with the phone slowly lowered it, thumb hovering above the screen like he was suddenly unsure of what he'd just recorded. The spell of mockery had broken, fractured by a single set of characters that told the truth they hadn't bothered to consider. Frank didn't look back. He didn't need to. In the passenger seat, his dog tag swung gently from the mirror, clinking like a wind chime with a memory. The plate had been a gift from his VFW chapter 10 years back, a quiet nod to service rendered, to valor awarded. Frank had never asked for it, but he'd never taken it off either. Some looked away now, embarrassed. Others stood stiff, staring like they were trying to reconcile what they'd seen with what they'd assumed. But none of them called out. because sometimes the loudest realization is the one that comes too late to apologize. The uniformed man at Pump 6 stood motionless as Frank's truck rolled out of sight, the license plate lingering in his mind like a headline carved in stone. His hand moved to his pocket with practiced calm, pulling out a slim black phone, no hesitation, no scrolling. He knew the number by heart. He turned slightly away from the pumps, the sun catching the edge of his silver insignia as he brought the phone to his ear. It rang once, then a voice on the other end picked up, and he spoke. Not loud, not urgent, but with a gravity that made every word feel like it carried weight beyond the moment. "I need a few guys here." A pause. No, not for backup, for respect. The voice on the other end said something, probably a question, but the officer kept his eyes on the place where Frank's truck had disappeared, jaw set like a man remembering something that never quite left him. "Vietnam vet," he said. "Bronze Star. Just got humiliated by a bunch of idiots filming him for clicks. Parking lot gas station. He didn't say a word, just took it and left." Another pause. He's still fighting battles, just quieter ones. The words came out evenly, but underneath them ran a current of something more personal. The kind of emotion that lives beneath the surface. Too disciplined to rise, but too deep to ignore. He knew what it meant to come home and find the war didn't end. Knew what it was like to carry silence because explaining the weight never worked. Watching a man like Frank walk away without even a flicker of anger, that wasn't weakness. That was weariness carved into flesh. He listened for a moment, nodded once, then said, 30 minutes. Come in full dress. No speeches, just presence." He ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket, exhaling through his nose. Around him, the gas station resumed its rhythm. The beep of a pump, the hiss of a soda machine from the storefront, the scattered footsteps of people eager to pretend nothing uncomfortable had happened. But the officer didn't move. His posture was the same, his stance calm, but now there was a purpose to the way he looked around. Not anger, not showmanship, just resolve. Some men stand tall out of pride, others because they've seen too much to kneel. And when they call, others answer. Inside the gas station's narrow convenience store, the air conditioning blasted too cold, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat outside. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, humming above shelves of dusty snack cakes and overpriced sunglasses. The door swung open hard, a burst of sunlight cutting across the linoleum floor before slamming shut behind Cole. He strutted toward the counter like he owned the place, the same smug grin stretched across his face, shoulders still riding the high of the scene he'd just made. In one hand, he held his phone, screen still glowing with the paused video. The clip of Frank standing beside his truck, silent and still, while laughter echoed around him. Behind the counter stood a clerk barely out of high school, a kid with earbuds half tucked into his collar, and the glazed look of someone who'd long stopped caring about anything that walked through the door. Cole didn't seem to notice or care. "Hey," he said, slapping the counter with his free hand. "You gotta see this." He angled the phone so the screen faced the clerk. Hit play. The video rolled. Frank's hunched figure appeared, his cane tapping lightly as he turned away from the jeers. The audio picked up Cole's own voice, loud, mocking, overlaying the moment like graffiti across a monument. "Old guy couldn't even speak straight," Cole said with a laugh, watching himself on the screen like it was a highlight reel. "Should have stayed home. Look at him, like something out of nursing home parade." The clerk didn't laugh, just gave a half-hearted shrug and muttered, "Huh," before going back to organizing a row of cigarette cartons. But Cole didn't notice the indifference. He was too busy rewinding, laughing at the way Frank's slow movements now looked exaggerated under the lens of ridicule. "Man, the internet's gonna eat this up," Cole said, pocketing the phone. "Stolen valor, my ass. Just because you got a limp doesn't mean you're some kind of hero." He grabbed a soda from the cooler, popped the tab before even paying, and leaned against the counter like a man celebrating a win. But outside, the wind had shifted, and Cole hadn't yet realized that the story he thought he owned was about to be rewritten. Because sometimes, the real measure of a man isn't in the voice that laughs the loudest. It's in the silence that follows when truth arrives. The gas station had returned to its usual rhythm. Idling engines, the hiss of pumps, and the occasional slam of a car door. The incident with the old man was fading, like a smudge on a window too faint to notice unless you looked hard. Cole had gone back outside, leaning against his bike with a bottle of soda in hand, still chuckling with his buddies about the show. Then came the sound. Subtle at first, low and slow, rubber on asphalt, heavy tires crunching gravel with a weight that turned heads. The kind of approach you didn't ignore. Not loud, but unmistakably intentional. A Humvee led the way, olive drab paint catching the sunlight, its grille like a squared jaw. Behind it, two black government SUVs followed in tight formation, engines humming with restrained power. No sirens, no fanfare. Just presence. They pulled into the gas station as one unit, parking not at the pumps but directly across from the storefront, where they commanded the full view of the lot. Doors opened in crisp synchronization like a scene rehearsed but never staged. Out stepped 6 men and 1 woman, all in full military dress. They didn't rush. They didn't speak. Each moved with the same measured precision, every fold of their uniforms razor-sharp, metals gleaming in the hard sunlight. Their shoes shined like mirrors, their postures straight enough to shame statues. The woman, a major by her insignia, took her place at the end of the line. The others fell into formation beside her, forming a single row. 7 pairs of polished boots hit the pavement in unison. Heads began to turn. Customers froze mid-pump. One man dropped his receipt. A teenager, halfway to his car with a bag of chips, stopped walking entirely. Even the gas station clerk, still behind the counter, leaned forward to press his face against the glass. The air shifted. Cole straightened up slowly, the bottle in his hand suddenly forgotten. He took a step back from his bike without realizing he'd moved. The laughter was gone. The smirk faded. Because whatever this was, it wasn't a ceremony. It was a reckoning. And when the first Marine adjusted his cover and lifted his chin, the message was clear. They weren't here for gas. They were here for respect. They moved as one, the 7 of them, stepping into a clean, straight line in front of the gas station's glass doors. Each step deliberate. Each movement precise. Not a word passed between them, but they didn't need to speak. Decades of discipline spoke louder than any command. Their formation was exact, down to the inches between shoulders and the tilt of their chins. These weren't actors. This wasn't a display. This was reverence wrapped in precision. The sun caught their medals, igniting flashes of gold, bronze, and deep crimson across their chests. Rows of ribbons, combat distinctions, service commendations, purple hearts, decorated their uniforms like the pages of stories most would never hear. These weren't parade pieces. These were earned. One by one, the gas station's casual rhythm collapsed under the weight of their presence. Pumps slowed, engines idled, conversations stalled mid-sentence. Customers glanced once, then again, pulled by something they didn't fully understand. A teenage boy lowered his phone from his ear, staring. A woman inside the store whispered to her daughter, pointing through the glass. Slowly, quietly, people began to gather, drawn like iron filings to a magnetic stillness. The air changed. The laughter that had stained the parking lot an hour ago was nowhere to be found. In its place was something older, something heavier, respect. Phones began to emerge, not for entertainment now, but in awe. Fingers moved in silence, recording not for clicks or ridicule, but to preserve, to remember, to say, "I was there." Cole stood frozen near his bike, the bottle in his hand now limp and sweating. He watched them but didn't speak. The swagger had drained from his stance, replaced by a tightness in his shoulders that had nothing to do with the heat. He didn't understand what was happening, but he understood enough to know it was no longer about him. The tallest of the uniformed men, a Marine with silver at his temples and a jaw like carved stone, stepped forward a single pace, just enough to distinguish himself from the line. He scanned the lot, calm, unhurried, until his eyes landed on Cole. Then he waited, not with anger, not with vengeance, with purpose. Because moments like this weren't about shouting over ignorance. They were about reminding the world what honor really looked like. The silence hung thick, heavier than the summer air, as the Marine with the silver at his temples took another step forward. His uniform bore the insignia of a full bird colonel, clean, gleaming, and unmistakable. The lines on his face told their own story. Years of command, hard choices, and the kind of leadership that doesn't flinch under fire. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Where is the man?" he said evenly, his words cutting through the parking lot like a slow-sharpened blade. "Who mocked Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney?" There was no wind, but it felt like the whole world exhaled at once. A rustle passed through the crowd like a shiver. Customers who had been pretending not to watch now stared openly. Phones lowered, chewing stopped. The mood, already reverent, shifted into something deeper, something like reckoning. The name hit the air with weight. Frank Delaney. It wasn't just a name anymore. It was an anchor, a line drawn in the concrete, a truth called into light. The crowd began to part, slowly, almost instinctively. A subtle motion like the shifting of a tide. People stepped aside without thinking, their eyes moving, not toward the colonel, but toward a single figure standing off to the side. Cole, the man who had laughed, the man who had recorded, the man who now, for the first time all day, had nothing to say. He looked smaller now, less sure of himself. His shoulders, once squared with bravado, sagged slightly. His feet shuffled once, then stilled. He tried to smirk, but it didn't quite form. The heat seemed to find him more than anyone else, like it had singled him out. The colonel's gaze didn't waver. Staff Sergeant Delaney served this country with distinction. He continued, each word deliberate, shaped like a measured truth. Bronze Star, combat veteran, 3 Purple Hearts, prisoner of war. He's more soldier in his silence than you'll be in a lifetime of noise. Cole opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The colonel didn't blink. The woman in uniform beside him adjusted her stance, the medals on her chest catching the light. Behind them, the other Marines stood like pillars, motionless, unwavering, undeniable. Cole took a step back, but there was nowhere to go, because when truth stands at attention in full dress blues, there's nothing left to hide behind. The colonel stood with his hands clasped behind his back, boots firmly planted, eyes steady as if he were briefing a command post, not addressing a crowd in a gas station parking lot. But there was gravity in his posture, the kind that made even the casual onlookers stop shifting their weight and start listening. "Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney," he began, voice clear and even, "served 3 tours in Vietnam." A murmur passed through the gathering crowd. Some glanced at one another, brows raised. The number alone was enough to quiet the last of the whispers. He was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor for actions taken during Operation MacArthur in the Central Highlands. Under heavy fire, he held his position to protect wounded men until reinforcements arrived. 11 soldiers made it home that night because of him. The words hung in the humid air like reverence carved from stone. He took shrapnel to the shoulder and leg, refused evacuation, went back into that jungle 3 more times to pull his men out. For that, he received 2 Purple Hearts. Someone in the back whispered, "My God," but it wasn't loud enough to break the rhythm. The colonel's eyes never left Cole. 6 months, he continued. 6 months in a North Vietnamese prison camp. Tortured, starved, isolated. Still refused to give up his men's positions. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the very earth had leaned in to listen. He came back to a country that barely looked him in the eye, the colonel said, quieter now but just as firm. He rebuilt his life, kept his silence, never asked for anything, never paraded his medals. But when he walks into a parking lot wearing that patch, the colonel pointed toward the space where Frank had stood, he's carrying every man who didn't come back with him. Eyes turned downward. Even the bikers, once puffed up with mockery, now stared at their boots. The woman in uniform beside the colonel kept her gaze on the horizon, her jaw tight, blinking once. Cole stood frozen, face pale. The earlier smugness long gone. He wasn't laughing now. The colonel let the silence breathe. Then he spoke one last time, his voice softer, but heavier than it had ever been. "That man you mocked, he didn't just survive history, he carried it." And this time no one had anything to say. The old Ford rumbled back into the gas station like it had never left. The sound of its tired engine, once so ordinary, now felt strangely out of place against the quiet that had settled over the lot. Frank hadn't planned on returning. Truth be told, he rarely circled back for anything once he'd left. But halfway down the road, reaching into the glove box for a mint, he realized his wallet was missing. He didn't groan or curse, just sighed, turned the truck around, and headed back the same way he'd come. Like he'd done 100 times before, in places far worse than a quiet parking lot. He expected to pull into the same pump, grab his wallet from the counter, and be on his way again before the sweat had time to bead on his neck. But what he saw as he turned in made his foot ease off the gas. 7 Marines stood in full dress uniform across the front of the gas station. Crisp lines, perfect formation, not speaking, not moving, just standing, waiting. The colonel was front and center, posture like a statue carved from purpose, medals on his chest catching the sun like sparks from a long dormant flame. And they were facing him. Frank slowed the truck to a crawl, confusion flickering across his brow. He pulled into a space near the entrance and turned off the engine. Silence settled inside the cab, but outside everything felt like it was humming, alive with some kind of unseen charge. He opened the door slowly, the creak of the hinge loud in the hush. The cane came down, 1 foot, then the other, deliberate, measured, still proud, even now. People stood in small clusters around the lot, their phones lowered, eyes wide. But no one spoke. As Frank stepped out fully, the formation moved. 7 Marines raised their right hands in unison, each one offering a sharp, flawless salute. For him. Frank froze, one hand gripping the edge of his truck door. His eyes flicked from the salutes to the colonel to the crowd, then back again. Something behind his ribs tightened, not fear, not pain. Something older, recognition. He didn't wave, didn't speak. just straightened his back as best he could and lifted his hand, returning the salute with the same steadiness he had given his entire youth to protect. For a man like Frank Delaney, this wasn't about attention. It was about finally being seen. The air stood still as if even the wind had paused to witness the moment. The 7 Marines held their salutes like a sacred promise, their white-gloved hands motionless, their faces unreadable but reverent, the sun caught on their metals and brass, casting glints of light that danced across the concrete like silent applause. In the center of the line, the colonel lowered his hand only after Frank had returned the gesture. His voice followed, deep and unwavering, carrying not just across the parking lot but through the hearts of everyone standing there. "Staff Sergeant Delaney," he called out, loud enough for all to hear, but with the tone of a man speaking directly to one. "Thank you for your service." There was no need for more. No speech, no theatrics, just truth, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. Frank stood beside his truck, his cane at his side, his face unreadable, but something behind his eyes softened. Not weak, not overwhelmed, just quietly moved. The kind of emotion that builds for years and finally finds a place to land. No one in the crowd moved. No one dared to speak. The gas pumps were still, the cars forgotten. Even the buzz of the nearby road felt distant, like the world had folded itself into this one singular moment of acknowledgement. A woman near the storefront pressed a hand to her mouth. Her shoulders trembled. A man in a ball cap turned away quickly, wiping his face. Another whispered, "My dad never got this." The words fell like a prayer. And in the back seat of the silver SUV, Caleb watched, his hands gripping the edge of the seat, mouth slightly open, breath caught halfway between disbelief and awe. He had never seen soldiers like this. Not in real life. Not this close. Not for someone like the quiet old man they'd laughed at. He didn't understand every part of what was happening. But he understood enough that this was honor, that this was respect not spoken but shown, that sometimes heroes looked like old men in faded caps and worn-out boots, and sometimes the world paused long enough to remember them. Frank lowered his hand and gave a single nod. Nothing more. But in that small gesture, something stirred across the entire lot, and for the first time in a long time, silence didn't mean being ignored. It meant reverence. It meant they were listening. The silence lingered long after the final salute had lowered. It wasn't awkward or uncertain. It was deliberate. The kind of silence that holds a room or a parking lot in its grip. No one moved. No one spoke. Because deep down, they all knew something had shifted. The colonel turned then, slow and deliberate, his boots making the faintest scrape against the pavement. His eyes found Cole, who now stood alone beside his bike, looking smaller than anyone had ever seen him. The bravado had vanished. His arms hung limply at his sides, soda forgotten in the dirt. Sweat beaded on his brow, not from the heat this time, but from the slow, suffocating weight of eyes, dozens of them watching. The colonel didn't raise his voice. "You mocked a war hero today," he said, each word carved from stone. "A man who gave more to this country than most people ever will. A man who bled on foreign soil so others could come home. A man who didn't ask for your thanks, just the simple dignity of being left in peace." Cole shifted, trying to speak, his voice catching before it could form anything coherent. I didn't know," he managed finally, his tone stripped bare. No swagger, no sharpness. The colonel didn't blink. "You didn't care," he replied. Those 3 words struck harder than any yell could have. There was no anger in them, no rage, just truth. Cold, clear, undeniable. You didn't care who he was. You didn't care what he carried. You just saw someone who didn't look like your idea of a warrior and decided he was worth less than your laughter. Cole looked down, eyes flicking toward the pavement like it might somehow shield him. The crowd said nothing, but their silence spoke for them. A reckoning had taken place, and Cole stood squarely in its path. The colonel took a single step closer. "Not everyone comes home whole," he said, voice softer now, but no less firm. "Some come home walking with pain, some with ghosts, some not at all. But every one of them deserves our respect. You don't have to understand what they've been through. You just have to remember that you didn't go through it." Cole nodded, too fast, too nervous. His throat worked hard to swallow something heavy. Shame, maybe, or understanding finally catching up. But by then, the moment had passed, and Frank Delaney had already been honored by men who knew the weight of silence better than words ever could. The crowd had begun to break apart, but the weight of the moment lingered like smoke after a fire. Quiet, persistent, inescapable. People moved slowly, unsure of what to say, of how to return to normal after watching something unspoken take place. The kind of moment that doesn't make headlines but settles into the bones. They left without talking much, casting backward glances, as if reluctant to step away from something that had reminded them what respect truly looked like. Frank remained where he was for a moment longer, his hand still at his side from that final salute. The Marines stood down, no longer in formation, but they lingered too, close, watchful, silent. Their presence wasn't overbearing. It was grounding, like a living tribute. They knew better than anyone that this wasn't about ceremony. It was about the kind of recognition that had come too late for too many. Frank turned from them, not with haste, but with purpose. His eyes scanned the lot until they landed on the boy, Caleb, still sitting in the back seat of the SUV, the door now open. His mother stood nearby, one hand gently resting on the frame of the door, the other pressed to her chest. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Caleb hadn't moved much. He was still gripping the edge of the seat with both hands, eyes locked on Frank like the old man had stepped out of a storybook instead of a pickup truck. His face held something deeper than awe, something like reverence. He hadn't understood all of what he'd seen, but he understood the most important part, that he'd just witnessed a kind of strength that didn't come from loud voices or big frames, but from something quiet and steady and earned. Frank approached slowly, every step deliberate. He stopped in front of the boy and looked at him, not down, not past, but at him. There was no patronizing smile, no long-winded speech. Instead, he reached up to his chest and tugged gently at the patch stitched into the fabric above his heart. It had been there for years. Faded, frayed, but not forgotten. The stitching gave way with a soft tear. He held it for a moment in his palm, as if remembering everything it stood for. Jungles, fire, silence, loss, brotherhood. Then he extended it. "You keep that," he said, voice gravel low but clear. "Not because it makes you a soldier, but because it should remind you to be better than me." Caleb took it with both hands, cradling it like something sacred. The fabric looked too big in his small palms. He didn't say a word, just blinked fast, then straightened in the seat. His chin lifted. His little hand rose to his temple in a salute, not perfect, not practiced, but honest. Frank's arm came up slowly in return. A quiet, firm salute, no flourish, no fanfare. And for a moment, it wasn't an old man and a boy. It was a passing of something invisible and eternal. A kind of legacy that didn't need bloodlines, only witness. Because courage doesn't end when the war is over. Sometimes it just wears different clothes, and sometimes in the quiet corners of the world it steps forward and hands itself down to someone who will carry it forward. If you've ever seen someone brave be disrespected, share this story, not because they need it, but because we do.